Hello and welcome to the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub podcast.
I'm Ollie Lamb.
And I'm Mike Castle.
We're here to bring you insights around all of the latest cutting-edge research within coach education and practice.
You can stay up to date with all of our latest episodes through the links in the podcast description below.
We hope you enjoy the episode.
Hi everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub podcast. I'm your host for today, Mike Castle, and I'm joined by Charlie and Robyn. Today we're going to be talking about sustaining the unsustainable, meaningful longevity and the doing of coaching. Quick intros to start with, Charlie.
Yeah, Charlie Corsby, and I am on the lecturing staff here at Cardiff Met.
Likewise, I'm Robyn Jones, and I am also on the staff here at Cardiff Met, a professor of sport and social theory.
Right, inspiration for the paper. It's quite an interesting topic area, this one that's probably been a long time coming. Robyn, you mentioned this has been something that you really wanted to get your teeth into for some time. Who's kicking us off with the inspiration for the paper there?
I'll start with the overview of where this came from, and then Robyn can fill in a bit of the detail. So this specific paper comes from a wider project. So in 2019, we secured some funding from UEFA as a part of their research program. And the wider project was around understanding the challenges, the vexes, the complexities of being an elite professional coach. So what it's like in the everyday practice of being an elite coach. And it kind of, the project speaks to, in a more general sense, some conversation around mental health. So what it's like to be as an elite professional coach. And as a result of that, we collected the data, fulfilled the requirements for UEFA, and we've got that UEFA report, and they funded that. And out of that, so as a part of the dissemination, we have a series of papers that are out or coming out. And one of them is called Contending with Vulnerability. So it's an empirical demonstration of what it's like to be an elite professional coach, and we problematize some of the ways in which coaches were talking about their work. So I'm sure we'll kind of cover some of that ground today. And then out of the data collection, we're then having these series of conversations around sustainability. And particularly, why is it that you coach? Why is it that we coach? So this project was with Robyn, myself, and Andy Lane. And we were having these series of conversations whilst we were looking at the data, whilst we were collecting the data, writing it up. And we just felt like there was kind of something in the conversations. There was a hunch there that we wanted to follow. And that kind of reflects the introduction where Robyn speaks about a review that he had some years ago. So that's where the kind of inspiration came from, and we'll go into the details of what that looks like, I'm sure.
So the reviewer's comment was on a piece of your work, Robyn?
It was. This paper has been in the works for many years, however you define the works. It's been nibbling away at me for a long time about, if this is so difficult, stressful, and problematic, why do you coach? Why do you and others coach? Obviously, I'd written something just to kind of satisfy the reviewer at the time, which is akin to self-actualization. I think I became somebody through my coaching. I always felt it wasn't quite a satisfactory answer. So it's always, nibbled away at me and bothered me. So that was some of the motivational fuel, that we used to actually sculpt this. But although, in lots of ways, I knew there was more there. I felt there was more there. I couldn't label, and the discussion we had earlier about sort of labeling things, about not having the ideas at hand to actually identify and develop, that wasn't there. But this was how I felt my coaching. It wasn't how I heard. It wasn't how I observed. It was how I felt my coaching. So this was really an account from the inside out, as opposed to researching kind of from the outside in.
You felt your coaching as in, you felt it was unsustainable, or you felt you had a sustainable sort of sense of your practice and you wanted to share that with everyone?
I was trying to explore it in a way that, because it is difficult. It's difficult, it's kind of stressful, and yet it's enormously joyful. It's absolutely wonderful. It's a buzz, adrenaline rush, all those kind of things. So that's how I felt my coaching. I'd obviously invested like a lot of myself in the job. So that's what I mean when I say I felt it. And then the more I read, the more ideas I was able to actually explore this kind of feeling of actually what it's like to be a coach, especially at the end of an event. It was a game of football for me, but it could be perhaps any kind of sporting event that a coach is involved in. So it was how I experienced it. It was the experience of coaching.
And in the introduction to the paper, you've kind of pointed that this is an alternative perspective in trying to present coaching as something that is or can be sustainable. You're sort of, I guess, tackling that idea that coaching is somewhat unsustainable in its perception sometimes. So how is it we've reached a point as a field where we're referring to coaching as being unsustainable? How is it that we've come to that? Has it always been like this?
I think yes. I mean, some of the work in the later years, maybe from kind of psychological viewpoints, have spoken about burnout and stress. I think it was always there, but then we started to have some kind of labels attached to it so we could understand it. But I also thought it's something of an addiction. It's something of compulsion, maybe is a better word than addiction. But it's a difficult thing to let go once you have coached. Because of the great self-investment, perhaps identity development within it. It's hard not to. It's not something that that you leave behind at 5 o'clock on a Friday and then re-enter at 9 o'clock on a Monday. It's just not like that. And maybe it should be a little bit more like that. And this is what we actually can speak to. But what we didn't want to do was to alter or make a case for altering what the essence of the job actually was. Why is it so compulsive? We didn't want to lose, because that's a big attraction of it. The highs are so high. But we didn't want to make the lows kind of so low that you also kind of suffer as a result of not having the result that you want to have as a coach. But we didn't want to take away from the joyous experience, because that what makes it really the compulsion that it is.
I think to add into that as well, from the wider UEFA project, the way that the coaches were talking about their coaching practice was fascinating to link to what Robyn's saying. So you've got this compulsive experience that is an essential feature of what coaches are experiencing. Robyn was talking about it. Andy and I both agreed, we really resonated with that conversation. And when we were then trying to do the data collection, so we used interviews as a part of the research design, we went to elite coaches and we were actually asking them these kinds of questions. Why is it that you keep coming back? What is it that allows you to keep coming back? And some of the kind of the narrative, the explanation that we were getting from the coaches was driven in this sense of working really hard. Like, I need to work really hard, so I just got to keep getting back up. I've got to be the first one in the door. I've got to be the last one out the door. I can't expect anyone else to do what I won't do. And then going on to more specific things like, I'm the one who's in charge, so I'm going to have to set the tone. I'm the one who's going to give these ideas. We've got to do it my way or the highway type kind of answers. And so what was actually coming out then is something that is incredibly unsustainable, but it was sustainable for them, the way that they were talking about the work. And this is where some of the tensions around the actual paper come from. So it comes from this wider project and how the coaches are talking about it, linked in with these kind of ambivalent experiences, these real extreme experiences that you have, the absolute joys of success and results, and then also the pain and the frustration of results and how others are and how others treat you as a result of coaching. And so it's this kind of medley all together. So when we're talking about sustainability and unsustainability, I think it's really important not to create this kind of dichotomy between them. It's not an either or. It's not that it's unsustainable and therefore we want to make it sustainable, or these are like how-tos to make it sustainable. But it's really trying to get a grip of, well, what are we talking about when we're talking about sustainability? What are the things that we are alluding to that are unsustainable? And I think the way that some of the coaches were talking about their practice and the way that they would do things, and therefore reflecting some of the norms in the organizations that they're working in, were unsustainable. They are not particularly, I think if we could sit down and reconceptualize the whole of the work, we probably wouldn't conceptualize it in that particular way. And so this is where the sustainability conversation comes around. Yeah, meaningful sustainability, not just something that is economic or something that is external to what people do. It's located in exactly what people are doing. Hence in the title, The Doing of Sports Coaching. This is based upon what people are doing, and that's where we locate the conversation around sustainability and unsustainability.
And you say this emanates from a UEFA project, so it's a football coaching context. You're both football coaches. Were you able to sort of read yourselves a little bit into the experiences that the coaches were having yourself? Did you recognise a bit of yourself in those coaches' stories?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we almost, I suppose one of the points that I'd make off the back of that is, maybe without putting words in Robyn's mouth, this is the nudge, the project, the data collection and the data analysis that we were going through was almost the nudge that Robyn needed to kind of get some of this moving. And it was because of that we were asking the set of questions, getting these responses, having a conversation around the responses, sifting through them, bringing in our own experiences as well. And actually, the resonation with it, and also the kind of dissatisfaction, well, why is it this way, was really where kind of the seed of this work comes from, alongside the longer history that Robyn's already mentioned.
I think the project was also, so multi-layered in a way, because so Charlie was the one who secured the funding from UEFA. So we had an external master, like in lots of ways. And in order that you get funding these days, which is some of the stresses, like of working at university, there are certain agendas that are in vogue, and you're more likely to have funding if you weave certain agendas into the bid. So we'd written in that we were going to explore some of the difficulties, enablers, problematics of what it's like to be a coach. So look, strong hints of exploring the actual kind of phenomenon of coaching. So we kind of thought we knew what we found, and we did, because as Charlie says, first in, last out. Wouldn't ask anybody to do anybody. I'm okay to get the sack as long as I do it my way. I need to control all of those things. When we then asked, which was the question I was asked, why do you do it? The answer inevitably was, I wouldn't have it any other way. I love it. And this was traveling up to Hartlepool on a Wednesday night because there's no scouts. So that individual had to do his own scouting, and obviously a time away from the family, just enormous self-investment in the job, but wouldn't have it any other way. So then we started to actually explore, well, what is it? What is it that's so enjoyable about it? That is the rush that gives such meaning to existence.
You sort of reminded me of a conversation from the first season of the podcast with Robyn Jones and Ellie Lewis, director of a tennis academy here in Cardiff. And they talk about that sense of sort of sacrifice that they're making. It was about women's narratives moving into coaching in tennis, the sacrifice they're making of family, having children, other working opportunities and things like that for the profession of coaching. Let's speak a little bit about the fact they've fallen into it, but we'd sort of see that as almost being a somewhat unhealthy kind of narrative to have to follow. But this is something, I guess, in the project work that you're doing, that is extending far above and beyond just entry to the field itself and to the profession. It's actually something that is almost always there. It's a part of the profession itself.
Yeah, and I think this speaks to the tension in the data set and in the way that we talk about coaching and the way that we think about coaching more generally. We can take those isolated examples and you could describe them as unhealthy, but there's also, as Robyn's alluded to, something that is extremely healthy in that as well. It's meaningful that coaches or people who do coaching, they find something and they realize something in themselves as a result of doing the coaching, which makes their work meaningful. And so hence why they keep coming back to it as well. And it's trying to kind of allude to some of this. Well, where's the meaning come from? How is this shaped from some of the expectations in the organization? How is it shaped by some of the norms and the expectations of coaching? And I think even more fundamental than that, it's really starting to think through, well, what are you doing when you coach? What's essential to coaching? Hence why we probably end up in some kind of territory around authenticity, Heidegger's work, phenomenology towards the end of the article, because it helps us actually ask and get to some of these questions around what's essential to coaching, and then how that then shapes those people who are doing coaching, their experiences of it, and how we might then start to think differently, reconceptualize, start to think about sustainability, but not just these simple, again, how to individualistic recommendations. You take, put your phone off after 5 o'clock. Not possible, not happening. To not review footage over the opposition. Okay, these are questions you might ask yourself in terms of, well, do I really need this? And trying to think through some of these examples in terms of how can I really understand what's meaningful and what is not so meaningful, what is sustainable and actually what's unsustainable but allows me to be sustainable. I feel like I need to do this because it's best prepared so that I can perform the best way that I can, but I can claw it back. I can claw back time and meaning somewhere else, or I can drop something. And it's speaking to these tensions, I think, that we really want to get to in the paper, as opposed to, again, some kind of simplistic how-to technique, mindfulness. I'm kind of generalizing and being a bit facetious, but you can see where I'm going at. These overly simplistic resolutions that you find usually on social media, but they are espoused out of research as well. And you can see them in the way that some particularly interventionist type research constructs some of this work that actually is based upon some really faulty ideas that don't represent the practice itself and what the people in the practice are doing. Whereas we would like to think that this comes from a set of coaches who talk about what they do when they're coaching. Likewise, the research team who resonate with that and trying to create that argument too.
It's not about demonizing the way that we do coaching at the minute in terms of the structures that we follow, those texts that you have to deal with at 10 o'clock in the evening or the antisocial hours or anything. It's actually trying to look at the nature of the profession itself and go, do you know what, it adds meaning to people's lives, and so therefore it is actually something that is sustainable. But we typically demonize these things that take maybe meaning away from other aspects of life, like family and things like that.
One of the things we tried to do, in the early phase of the paper, is to explore why. Why is it so compulsive? And this is where, it's Warren Fraley's early work, which was really acted upon and developed by the sport philosopher Scott Kretschmer, really speak about sweet anxiety of uncertainty. Okay, now I defy any coach when they're watching their athletes maybe walking out onto the field or into the gym or into the sporting arena, not to feel that that sense of excitement, of uncertainty, laced with dread. So what is it then that makes it so attractive? And we kind of make the case largely on the basis of the evidence that I would do it anyway. That it's this that makes the job so unique, in that respect, because it's almost as if it kind of sharpens your senses. It makes you live right in that moment. And it gives you a sense of possibilities about what might happen. You're basically not thinking about anything else, which you normally do largely, like, what am I doing at 5 o'clock this evening? Or shall I go for a cup of coffee with Mike later on? Or no, I don't like him very much, or I won't. But you're living right in that second. And it's exhilarating. But of course, with that, if things are not going to go like as one wishes, as desires, then there's a downer, and that's what makes it largely unsustainable because you cannot exist long term on this roller coaster. It's just quite destructive in lots of ways.
I think I'd add to that as well, that with that sweet tension of uncertainty, we advocate and we position the coach as a part of that practice, as a part of watching the game. It's not just that the game's unfolding and you're getting enjoyment out of the opponents playing against each other. In the paper, we really try and emphasize in the way we were talking about it that actually the coach is actively shaping a part of that. They feel like one of the team, the organization around them, they're representing the organization. It's their ideas that are trying to come out alongside those who are trying to enact those ideas, which is all of these relations that are going on that actually make it so sweet and so uncertain as well. Have I got the tactics right for today? I know that last time we played them, this is what went on, and so I'm going to do something different. And seeing that unfold is where the real joy and the pleasure of it all comes together as well, which again starts to speak to some of the essential features of coaching. It's what makes it amazing. Again, I echo Robyn's comments. It's an unbelievable feeling when you're working with a group of people and you feel like you've moved them forward and you feel like you've influenced them, and they're expressing your ideas and you're taking on their ideas and you're collaboratively working together. It's the best bit, but also it comes with a whole host of working hard, doing things the right way, an obsession with the job, a compulsion with the job, which in some senses and has been linked to some really unhealthy practices too. And that's where it comes back to this tension around sustainability and unsustainability.
I think because of the highs, Mike, I'll just finish on this point. Because of the highs are so high and so enjoyable, the coach will try to control every aspect of the practice, of the environment, to actually ensure that there's more of these things, because they are compelled, or to a slight degree, they're addicted to it. So they will try just to control everything. And, we all know we can't, but it doesn't stop us from trying. And this becomes the unsustainability behind it, and all the work at the ground level, I call it, at the grassroots level. And they're unable to actually lift themselves up to get like an overview about, well, do I have to do all that right now? Do I have to be here? Can I not just work in another way? To give them some longevity and to give them a different overview and perspective, rather than just kind of rushing around everywhere, just doing stuff that they don't necessarily have to do or worry about.
I would also add that one fundamental thing with the group of coaches who we were interviewing, they were governed by results too. And so we're not painting a neutral picture here either, in the sense of like the coaches that we're speaking to could get this sense of satisfaction, enjoyment out of it. But actually, there was a quite sincere relief out of results. If I keep results at bay, then I'm going to keep a job, which creates security for me in terms of my job, my actual employment status, as opposed to just the uncertainty of the outcome of the game, but also the precarity of the jobs that they're in. They're only a couple of games away from always getting, being under threat of losing their jobs in and of itself. So there was a results element to this as well, which ties to the actual organisations in which they're working and how that is reflective and shapes the coaching practice that they then succumb to.
But how they responded here was rather simplistically, we defined, you're too busy to improve then. As I guess a provocative kind of a question, but once they sat down and thought about it and took the defenses down a little bit, was that's something to think about. Are you too busy to improve?
It's really interesting that point about being governed by results. I think you probably struggle to find many coaches that don't have results at the forefront of their mind, really, with a lot of their coaching. That brings with it a huge amount of stress, a huge amount of, I guess, emotional labour in watching your athletes perform, trying to think about what's going to actually happen here. I'm drawing my mind back to watching my men's first team, Bucks team at the university, in a playoff last summer to reach the Premier Division. And I spent the whole day watching, enjoying, of course, but genuinely felt like there's absolutely no way they could possibly be as nervous as I am right now watching all of this unfold. And my heart rate, I don't think dropped below 80 or 90 for the whole day. I had it on my watch. I was looking at it. It was horrendous. We were 3-2 down actually at one point.
So why did you do this, Mike? To reflect the question.
I'll tell you what, it's a
back on
great
you.
question. Well, I think this is proof of the work, I suppose. I knew coming out of the other side of it, if the boys got promoted into the Premier, and they did, they went on to 3-2 down in rubbers and actually down in one of the final match, and then managed to win it in a playoff. At the end of it, I knew that I was getting a pat on the back because the boys had achieved promotion, and I felt like I'd played a part in that. There weren't any more fixtures then for the rest of the season. That was it, summer break. And I'm chomping at the bit to get back on court with everyone in the club, not just the boys that had achieved promotion, but all of the other teams, because I wanted them to feel the same amount of success.
Was that an exhausting experience for you?
Incredibly. I was absolutely knackered. If I had to do that every single week, I would be a broken man probably within 3 or 4 weeks. I still feel a sense of nervousness every Wednesday. When those Bucks fixtures are going on. Nothing quite like that, with the importance of the result in a playoff. It's essentially a knockout. You're up or you're staying exactly where you are for another season. There was that heightened sense of value on that one fixture, and it brought a huge amount of emotional labour to it. It was quite something. I mean, I was thinking about it for 2 weeks, 3 weeks before. So the labour, it wasn't just that one. It wasn't from the first spin of the racket to the last shot of the match. It was 3 or 4 weeks of build-up beforehand, putting in the extra shifts, the additional coaching on top on weekends as well as in the evenings or earlier in the morning to squeeze it in just to do a little bit more for in preparation for the match. It was tough, really tough. I probably needed the summer break afterwards, in fairness, but I was still chomping at the bit to go back to it. So that was really interesting. The paper itself, so you're calling for... feel free to correct me if I'm wrong here. A bit of a reconstructive agenda. You want to try and build that basis of understanding, getting at the essential phenomena of coaching here, recognizing that the highs and the lows are, I guess, a component of coaching. This is what it is. But at the same time, you're trying to help coaches to better deal with that uncertainty. No?
No. We wanted to better categorize and define and label really what is it about the compulsion, because we don't want to lose that attractiveness. We're not trying to say that you should care less. We're not trying to say that, because that's why we coach. That's obviously it can be overboard sometimes, that your whole identity is kind of circled around it, and obviously that's not particularly very healthy. But it's not an argument against the kind of sweet anxiety. It's to recognize that. But where the reconstructive agenda then comes in is to not how to cope with it, but what you can do about it so it doesn't become a destructive thing. So it's to reframe that bit. And part of that is to raise awareness and consciousness about, what do we really like about it? And how can we protect that without going overboard about it? And then how do we live with that, like as an individual? And how can we maybe have a somewhat, I guess, of an influence on the organizations that employ us, which is a difficult thing, because you rightly said your coaches operate on a short game and a long game. If you lose regular basis, you probably won't have a job at the level that we were interviewing. So we're not unrealistic with that. But if you only focus on week to week, then it's probably a recipe for reproduction, and it's it'll be a recipe for losing your job.
So this is me sort of falling into the trap, I suppose, of thinking that there is a way of coping, I suppose, with this, or there is a mechanism that I can use to deal with this, right? And that's, like you say, where the reconstruction is coming from. So it's not about coping; it's about that something else.
It's about reframing. Yeah.
So where does Fraley's work come into this, I suppose?
Before we get to Fraley, I'll pick up on the idea of coping, because coping as often associated within the literature, particularly in kind of sports psych, social psych literature, is treated in, from my understanding and my reading, a very individualistic term. Individual suffers a set of kind of stresses, or whatever you want to call it, and then leads to adversity, and therefore you have coping as a way of managing some of that. Some of the many different examples of it: psychological safety, resilience, coping mechanisms. There's lots of different terms in which it's used, but it's this sense of there are a set of factors that are impacting upon the individual, and so we need some kind of antidote in order for the individual to cope with it. That is fundamentally some of the issue that we're trying to take. That kind of conceptualization of it's the individual that we can try to shape here through a set of individualistic recommendations. And this is where the kind of how-to fixes comes in. That's not what we're arguing for here. It's trying to start to think about how the individual is in relation to others, how they are shaped in relation to others, how they're able to shape others, and then as a result of that, shape organizations, and where they can have influence, who is influencing them. So actually the second section of the paper around compulsion is a really crucial one, because this is an argument that actually is probably implicit in much of the literature in the last 20, 25 years that's really tried to shed light on the social relational nature of coaching. Well, what is it that is you're shaping? What is it that's shaping you? And can you really start to get a grip on it? And I think that is probably where the message lies, in terms of how can we start to develop individuals who have a sensitivity, a sharpness to their relations of coaching, and what the relations of coaching are doing to influence their experience of it. Because that is a sensitivity, a kind of reflexive consciousness that we're calling for, that you can work with, that you can educate, that you can start to develop, as opposed to, again, these kind of like quick fixes. And individualistic ones is the problematic one. And that really comes from the way in which a lot of the coaches were talking about their work. I must work harder. Again, it's an individualistic antidote. They must do it my way. If I'm going to get the sack, I want to do it my way. And so your relations in terms of the organization that you're working for, the people who are employing you, the people who are working with you, the people who you're trying to coach in themselves, the players, these are all shaping that experience. So it's trying to actually start to shift towards, well, what are the relations of coaching? Getting a better grip of just what it is that you're doing when you're coaching would actually speak to a little bit more around this sustainability and perhaps the unsustainability of it. And I think that the individualistic part is the unsustainable part, the ownership, the taking it on yourself narrative, and the consequence of your actions as a result of that. That is where I'd really kind of locate the rethinking, the reshaping of what we're trying to argue here. And in many ways, it's an argument that's been made for many, many years. We're just trying to actually bring it into the fore in a sense of forwardness, in a sense of how can we actually prepare people to do this role, to do this job.
And again, it's not to say that this to alter the fundamentals of coaching here. This argument is placed within a performance paradigm. We believe that thinking a little bit more like along these lines will genuinely help results in the longer term. Maybe in some ways, like in the shorter term, but more specifically in the longer term. So there's no, loading of all this responsibility and burden and like extra jobs like on the self. So one becomes their only point of reference. I think we've said it before that in this most kind of social of jobs externally, it's a very, very lonely job unless you take care internally.
I think your example, Mike, is a really good example of that, actually, because when you're talking about the playoff game that you had with your players, the success was there's an eagerness to your answer. I get some success out of it, but there's also the tension. The heart rate being higher was a result of others performing on your behalf. And it's a really clear example of this kind of individualistic, but you have to give yourself over to the performance of the others, but you're shaping that performance as well. And it's trying to recognize yourself as a part of that process, as a part of that relation, as opposed to, an individualistic way of coping around some of these ideas.
I think just furthering that, it's always our success. I'm sure that you would have used that discourse, when it's our success, we've done, like, etc. Of course, if they hadn't of, you would have internalized that blame just upon you. It's my failure.
What do you think the failure falls, the risk then falls more on the coach than it does the athletes? What is it about our position as coaches that means it typically comes that way?
Oh, I think it's learned. I think it's become something. It's the norms of coaching, like it's the individualism that Charlie speaks about, which we also saw, within the data was coming through loud and clear. The individuality, and I think we've spoken about this before as well, that coaches, lots of ways they have agency to act as individuals, but they have no support to act. So the individuals in a very, very sort of vulnerable sense.
Are we an easy target?
Yes, but we blame ourselves. And this comes to maybe policymakers and coach educators along, what are we educating about? Which again goes to Charlie's point about what are we trying to do here as coaches? And if we don't quite understand that or get nearer to that, then the question of what do we have within our coach education programs, what are we educating about and for then? And if we don't understand the first question first, then the second one becomes moot.
So is this something that needs to fit early in the education of coaches then?
Probably. I think there's elements of, how to, like, etc. can be, somewhat kind of helpful. But I've made the argument, like over many years, I would introduce some of the difficulties and complexities early, and then increase that complexity. So, the analogy often, you start off, if you're working with kind of football, you may have 1-on-1s, 3-on-3s then to get some depth and some width in it, increase the complexity to 5-on-5s as you work up the levels in age group, and then sort of finish with 11-on-11s, which has got enormous amount of, of complexity in there that a player probably only gets 2 minutes out of 90 on the ball, but he or she is hardly ever stopping thinking or running or engaged with the game. So the complexities are immense. Of course, the ball can move in all sorts of different directions. It can go backwards, forwards, etc. So it's to increase that complexity early, of course, in an accessible way, and then to actually increase it, with new knowledge as you go along.
So when you speak about coaching being somewhat compulsive, you also write about coaches spending oneself physically, emotionally. Charlie, you and I have spoken a couple of times about me having sore knees. I'm not taking the mick out of you with your 2 new knees sat there right now, but my sore knees after a coaching session, because I have to get on court and play and hit, and quite often I'm hitting with players that are probably better than me, so doing a lot of running. Why is it that coaches feel the need, or why do they feel obligated to spend oneself in that way? Why do I, for example, feel obligated to put my body on the line for a few other players?
Again, I would say it's learned. It's a part of the expectations of what you need to do in order to demonstrate your expertise as a coach. It's part of the practices that you have been shaped by, but you're also complicit in shaping. I'm sure there's lots of different scenarios that we could go through in terms of you trying to demonstrate prestige, authority, but also a way of impacting the players, by actually getting up close and personal with them as well. So I think there's lots of different answers that you could put out there in terms of why you might do it. What I think is a really interesting question to kind of think with and move back with is, how do you make some of those experiences meaningful? What is it that is shaping that relationship? How do I take meaning from that? What's meaningful from that set of experiences? If you throw one ball and then you end up opening up a conversation with a player and you walk away and you think, wow, the depth of that conversation was fascinating. That speaks to some of the compulsion when you get into these little hunches or nuggets in coaching that you think, wow, that was refreshing. So all of a sudden now you can start to think through, well, what am I doing that's meaningful and what am I doing that's less meaningful? If having sore knees after hitting loads of balls allowed you to generate something meaningful, then it becomes something that's more sustainable. If you're walking off the court thinking, I can't move now and I haven't even impacted anyone, then what are you doing? And this is the reflexive consciousness that we're kind of alluding to, and I think that's an example that really kind of brings to life I think some of the things that we're talking about there, and it really points to this kind of meaningfulness that the coach can take around the work that they're doing, and those set of experiences.
So again, coaches are quite often talking about the sacrifices being the price worth paying. Does it have to be sacrifice that adds meaning then to the activity? Does there have to be an element of sacrifice first that then contributes to some kind of an impact positively, hopefully, on a player's development in order for that to be meaningful?
Well, I think the sacrifice is probably the problematic bit, that we're describing it as a sacrifice. And in describing it as sacrificial, we're describing it in quite an individualistic way, that I, as the coach, am going to fall on my sword here, as if I'm the one that's going to, I will put myself through this for you to make sure that you develop. This very individualistic narrative in and of itself. So I think actually starting to try and challenge some of the ways that we might talk about coaching, and the sharedness behind that, and how you're acting on behalf of an organisation as well, and the expectation the organisation has. And there's people who are imposing those expectations on you, and trying to think through some of these tensions and contradictions, and not just this like, I'm going to give myself over to you, that I give everything to you as players or as an organization. I think that's actually part of the unsustainability, and as the narrative shifts in that direction, that's probably where we would start to take some issue with it, without then the reverse being, we'll get rid of it, that you then become, everything's shared. There is an egotistical part to it. There's compelling parts to it. It's fascinating. It's so enjoyable working with others and getting results. And not to get rid of that, but actually start to think, well, how does that narrative and those norms fit with sustainability and your personal sustainability of doing the practice in itself? And it speaks to a much wider question around just what it is that you're doing when you're coaching. And if you start to get into that question, then you can then reconceptualize some of the previous conversations like sacrifice.
I think you can draw something of a link, always carefully, and then between meaningfulness and well-being. We work at a university. And the language and the discourse around is going to sometimes, especially in the last 3-4 years, has been about the well-being of staff. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that it doesn't, and it kind of should not reach into maybe no emails over the weekend, or no emails after 3 o'clock on a Friday. It goes to identifying the work you're doing having meaning. So, and I'm not advocating that we should all work every weekend and all this sort of thing. That's absolutely not. But if you have awareness and recognition and consciousness of the work that you're doing, I'm trying to do this. It has meaning, for me and for the organization, the environment. Then that's well-being. And it goes to really kind of some of, the argument that we make here is to raise awareness and consciousness, like about about the sweet anxiety, about what are you trying to do here? What are your thoughts intended at and directed at, which is the intentionality. So once we can get coaches and maybe organizations kind of thinking a little bit along those lines, their work will have more meaning for them. So they're not so lost in this overwhelming life of immediacy and a busyness that they can't seem to escape from because they feel they have to.
Yeah, you've spoken to us a few times before on the podcast about that, the importance of that intentionality. So it's certainly come into the fore here. So can you speak to us a little bit more about that importance of intentionality? How is it that intentionality helps us to better perceive coaching as this sustainable activity?
It comes from wider literature about existentialism again, which again is trying to ensure that you respect, that you sculpt your own destiny as best you can. You can't do anything you want, of course, but as best you can with what you have at the moment, you take responsibility for it. Now, it's not intentionality is not meant in the usual sense that you and I in everyday language would use it. Perhaps it's motivation, but it's intended at. A thought is intended at something. So we don't just think; we think about something, and so it's really intentionality. Is a direction of thought or action. It's intended towards. So what is it intended at? Then becomes the issue, and linked to the meaningfulness. What am I trying to do here? Like in relation to what I want to happen, my short-term goals, my long-term goals. So it goes to more practical issues. Does a coach really have to review all the footage that Charlie was speaking about? Does that mean that he or she is more concerned with the opposition really than with the overall action and performance, like of their own sides? Can somebody else get involved with some of the everyday jobs that they can then maybe lift themselves up and not be, as I said before, too busy to improve, because you need space and time to think to improve. Is the reading, the engagement. But if you don't allow yourself that time because you're locked into this kind of spiral of hecticness, of immediacy, you become blinded by that. And therefore you argue, well, I haven't got time for that. I haven't got time for that.
Is there a dark side to this notion, in a sense of a coach believes that performing a certain activity, watching all of the footage, or extending their work later into the evening, or going on a trip up to Hartlepool because they haven't got a scout to go and watch a game, but that's perceived to them as a justifiable activity, this sort of act of heroism that brings meaning to their life. It's still an unhealthy activity, I guess, or it could potentially, or there must be a tipping point where it becomes totally unsustainable.
And hence the unsustainability that we speak about in the paper.
Yeah, but there must, is there? I suppose I'm searching here for a somewhat particular answer, I suppose, which I probably shouldn't be doing. But there must be a tipping point to where we want coaches to try and perceive their work as having that meaning and therefore being that little bit more sustainable. But that as a rationale for saying cheerio to the husband and the kids, or the wife and the kids, I'm off up to. Because they believe it's part of what they should be doing and they believe it brings meaning to their life, can actually still go a bit too far, no?
Oh, sure. Yeah, which is the unsustainability that that we're alluding to.
So there's still an element of, I suppose, care that has to come then with that intentionality. You can have the best intention in the world.
Yeah, I think what you're referring to is a lack of consciousness, about what am I trying to do here? And do I have to do all of these things in order to improve the practice? Is my time kind of better spent, maybe, dare I say it, so reading something, kind of thinking about something? Would that then influence my practice to go out to my session at 7:30 because it's still a performance paradigm? Don't want not to emphasize that. We're advocating something that would last longer and we would argue maybe have better results within the performance paradigm.
I think the idea of authenticity has quite a lot of grasp here. It could be really helpful because the authenticity that we refer to in the paper and other papers as well is in reference to a sharpness of your relations to others. And that is the kind of intentionality, the consciousness of your relations to others that we're trying to describe around an authentic coaching practice, not authentic in the sense of being true to yourself, but authentic in terms of understanding the relations around you. And then that really helps start to think about, well, what's also inauthentic. As Jean-Paul Sartre calls it, acting in bad faith. The classic example is a waiter who is stuck in as being a waiter, serving, finishes the shift, knocks off, says, I hate my job, waiting is terrible, and then they go back to being a waiter and they continue doing the waiter, and they're acting in bad faith because they're not conscious of the relations around them, i.e. what they're doing when they're waiting, this is what we're talking about with coaching, or actually the possibility that they could go and do something else. They're acting in bad faith because they're not engaging in that. And we don't mention it in the paper, but it has this kind of connotations to it around trying to become sharper to your relations, be more authentic in terms of what you are being conscious of when you're coaching, and therefore how you might then reshape some of that. And that speaks to, on the field, the performance element that Robyn's stressing, but it speaks to relations away from the field. Those who you work with, other coaches, those within the organisation, the ones that keep the cogs turning over in the organisation, perhaps members who are higher up and making strategic decisions for the organisation, and of course those who are away from coaching practice as well, having a consciousness of what that looks like, how they are shaping your meaningfulness to and your relationship to the job. I'm really trying to bring that conversation to the fore, I think is again what we're trying to do here.
Speaking a little bit, I suppose, to some of the implications of the paper, raising that level of awareness, things that coaches need to be aware of, relations to others and those sorts of things. Robyn, you've just spoken a little bit about the intentionality with which coaches are working, etc. It's not just about relationship with athletes, though. It goes much further than that. It's also relationship with, or at least an understanding of, the structures around the outside. So earlier on in the podcast, we talked about the need for coaches to get results as well. It's also about actually looking at, okay, who do I work for? What is it that my employer values? What is it that my employer is after as far as strategy goes, or something like that? So there's a much bigger picture at play here, rather than just it's me and my athletes that many of us probably spend most of our time thinking about.
Of course, yeah, it's contextual and it's relational. And the inspiration for this and much of what we're talking about now is for elite professional coaches, but it fits in with all levels, grassroots. The breadth of the job at a grassroots club, when you're trying to have a more of an activator role in coaching, it's the same thing. You've got a group of people in front of you, you've got different people with different pressures, you've got to secure locations to coach, you've got equipment to worry about. The breadth of the task becomes huge. And as you go up the ladder and the performance ladder, the breadth might narrow down a little bit because you've got more people you're working with, but then the possibilities become absolutely immense as well in terms of the need to get results, the need to get the best out of the organization. And I think that really speaks to the kind of the dual points that we talk about in the second half of the paper around the individual level and the structural level. And trying to think about how you fit the individual within a particular organization. Again, you are not, as much as we would like to stress the possibilities, you are not free to do what you want to do. You are not free to do that. You are shaped by those around you. But that doesn't mean that you are only shaped by those around you. You have the ability, the agency to start to make some change as well. And again, that's the kind of example of the sharpness of relations that we're referring to. Who can you influence? When can you have an influence over them? What are the consequences short term? How is that going to fit with the long term? Okay, at the moment, this is a current practice that's unsustainable. So how do I start to turn that tank around through different interactions, different strategies, different influences over the individuals that you think is going to shape that? And that's why we bring that conversation, that wrapping around of the individual within their context and the organization in which they're working in.
And is this where you're speaking a little bit to trying to liberate coaches from those everydays by becoming aware of these relations and how they could perhaps actually have or realize they have the agency to change things? They become therefore liberated from just doing the same old.
Yeah. Charlie, mentioned kind of Sartre in there. One of his famous lines is we are condemned to be free. So, but again, it's not you can do anything you want whenever you want and you have this unfettered agency. It's not talking about that at all. But we always have more agency really than we think. And if we're not aware of these things, what we're invariably involved in is reproduction. We do the same, not quite the same, obviously, because every context is slightly different. It may be cold, it may be raining, there may be less players, but largely you are reproducing the practice. So by giving them a sense of agency, a sense of responsibility, then it encourages maybe like an alteration in the status quo, which at the moment, I think, as we try to explain and to deconstruct, is quite unsustainable. Because from the interviews that we did, these coaches, it was quite obvious that their language, really, and what they said they did, was learned. It was learned from what they thought was expected of them, from what they thought that they should say. And this is not saying that they were insincere in what they said. They were very, very hard-working individuals, but they were locked into a world somehow that they didn't see any other way out except to justify it in terms of, I wouldn't have it any other way, which of course is unsustainable.
I think what I'd add into there as well is, you quite rightly mentioned, Mike, this is about coaching. It's not just about coaches, trying to shift away from just what coaches are doing to make it sustainable. It's how sustainability might be bred through an organization, through the structures within that organization. A simple example might relate to the precarity of professional football. Coaches are not given time to work with their players, yet they are expected to get results immediately, to have a bounce effect and tend to maintain it. And you have these kind of tensions here. How do you play the short game and the long game? But that decision is not the coach's decision, because every coach you speak to says, I need more time. They need more time. So it's the organization that is also imposing some of these pressures onto the coaches. So it's a coaching issue, coaching sustainability issue, not just a coach's sustainability issue.
And maybe something of a way forward in my idealistic world, Mike, would be for coaches haven't got a union, have they? They don't have an advocacy organization. Now, of course, this is not to say that all coaches will go on strike if one of them gets the sack. But there is no advocacy for coaches. So again, we go back to the individualism that Charlie speaks about. You are left to be an individual in this most vulnerable of senses, and hence you take on this enormous workload in order to try to mitigate that and to make sure that you don't get the sack, although you probably know that it's going to happen, and you justify it in terms of, well, I did my best. But that's something that maybe eventually up the line, as we get to something of a maturity of a profession and what it should stand for, not just the word of being a profession.
Interestingly, it also speaks to the sweet tension that we mentioned earlier, though, the possibility of someone new coming in and then getting the bounce and the change that you're looking for. And this really kind of speaks to, again, like some of the just whatness of what's going on there. You almost, I think some of the clubs, we could name Premier League football clubs now, some of them who appear to be rotten. It doesn't matter who they get in, they still get the same issues. But the next person comes in and they still believe their starting point is that they are going to...
They're the person to change it.
Yeah, and that's also, that's where the sweet tension of the uncertainty comes in. Yeah, that there is a sweetness to that I could be the one that ends up turning this oil tanker around. But I believe, and based upon the body of evidence that we have over the last 20 years, the ones that are able to do that, they are able to turn the tide, are the ones that are able to have influence on the players, influence on key members within those organisations, and they start to make change within that organisation. Now, it's so hard to really prove that and even do that because you don't get access to these. But the body of evidence that we have would certainly support that from the organisations in which we've studied and the people that we've spoken to.
We've spoken quite a lot about that individual level. We're just touching on it a little bit now. The structural level. What is it you're calling for in this paper at a structural level?
I think very much like we've just mentioned, it's linked to asking organisations to recognise again just what is going on with coaching. I think that is a call. What coaches are doing when they're coaching. I think that's definitely a call of what we're asking for. And to recognise their role within supporting the sustainability of those who are doing the job. We talk about precarity a little bit so far, the precarity of the job, the support that they might have, the expectations in terms of their job role, all of the structural things that might influence how the job's done. Finances, expectations, support of staff, the expectations on the manager, the longevity that the manager might be given, how the organisation is trying to act and support. So all of these features, I think, come back to a change for structural sustainability. I suppose one thing that I would add in, and perhaps it's a rereading the paper, perhaps is a slight critique that I might make of our own work, is the separation that we've made between the individual and the structural. We've tried not to, in the argument of the work, be so clear in this separation as if they're two separate things. People are doing this work, and so people are enacting this sense of like micro and macro. It's not an either or here. That people are doing the work. They are expressing the norms as they're going, and therefore the norms are expressed through their work. And it's not to be divisive in the way that we might conceptualize that, even though in the paper, rereading it was something that kind of struck out to me. So it's not just, right, organisation do this, individuals do this. They're wrapping around each other. The organisation is a consequence of what the people who are in the organisation are doing, and what they do then shapes what the people do as a result of that. So it's the wrapping round of those two, I think, is a really crucial part. To not get confused with this just, well, here's a set of objectives that an organisation can put in place, because they have to be lived, they have to be done by the people who are in the organisation. And as we've already expressed, those narratives, those practices, they're learned. And so you have to find a way of restructuring them, reconceptualizing, redoing them in that way to, I've used the analogy already, but turn the tank around.
It's an interesting point, actually, because I suppose in that structural section, you're talking a bit about, okay, there's structures and there's rules and expectations, but these are social systems. They're, I suppose, a product of human beings, but the coaches fit into that. So actually part of this is, I'm sure you've referred to it, but actually coaches understanding that they have actually probably more influence than they think within that social system. And
it's the consciousness that we're talking about. We're not talking about, sustainability as having greater longevity, or coaching as being maybe less unstable than what it is. We're talking about coaches having a better understanding of the meaningfulness of what they direct their efforts at. So they understand that to a greater degree. And if you can do that, you're calmer in yourself. Again, I go back to this thing that you see them rushing around everywhere, doing everything, first in, last out. So, you don't have to exist like that as a coach. You may think you do, but you do not have to exist like that. So it's to avoid, if you're talking about, okay, how to change this, coach educators have a role, if they so decide to actually accept it, to avoid, short, quick fixes, because we want something that's a bit more, dare I say, so meaningful, like and deep here, that is altering the way that coaches actually look at what they do whilst coaching and what are they trying to do. So, we've written earlier about trying to get at the just whatness of the practice, and then you're educating with that in mind. Now you're changing the mindset that Charlie says can work upwards into organizational change then. But you can't do everything you want to do. Absolutely not. But you're condemned to be free.
So we're just over the hour mark. We've been going for a little while on this. an interesting question, I hope, for this one. I mean, it was an incredibly insightful paper for me. You got me really thinking about the positions I hold in the tennis structure here at the university and the types of jobs and roles we create and how we envisage what we want our coaching jobs to look like. You know, we've taken what we think are steps to try and ensure a level of sustainability. We don't program coaching on weekends, for example. We we created coaching contracts, so people have pensions and they have a salary that they know is consistent, etc. They've got an open-ended contract, so there's an element of security there. So I'm thinking about these changes, but this paper's a lot more than just changing the odds and ends and saying, oh, this makes it therefore more sustainable. It draws much more sort of, it speaks a lot more to the consciousness of the decisions that we make as coaches and the influence through which we actually have. So a really interesting read. It took me a couple of reads through, in fairness, I will admit. There's some tough stuff in there, but I think a really important paper. The question I have then is, what's the impact that you would like the paper to have? Because this is stemming it's not just an isolated piece of work. This is a much bigger project that you've got going on with UEFA. So is there a slightly larger impact that you're sort of hoping for as a result of this paper?
I think you probably touch upon it. It's the accumulation of the argument that's being made. Again, I think it's unrealistic for one paper to be such a marquee shift in everything. I think that, as much as I would love that to happen, but I think it's the accumulation and the pulling together some of the body of evidence that has come in the previous 20 or so years. It's really starting to sharpen what that evidence is actually pointing towards, asking questions that we've already alluded to around just whatness of coaching, and therefore speaks to better education of coaches, coach educators, organisers, people who work in organisations, and speaking to coaching more generally. I think that is where I'd really like the impact to have. And if this is a kind of paper that opens up that conversation, that then sheds light on the previous kind of 20, 25 years of evidence that really supports some of this work, then that would be kind of a dream for the paper. But it's not that the paper on its own will do this. It's a culmination. It's bringing together a series of discussions, contemplations that we've had whilst doing the project, alongside previous experiences, alongside the practice that we're engaged in on a day-to-day basis. And so it's really trying to, I think, really trying to have that as an impact. Trying to pull it all together, I think, is where I would like it to go.
We have workshops next week, actually, with Sport Wales, coach developers, and with the Welsh Rugby Union level 4 coaches. This will go straight into those workshops. And what we want to emphasize within it is to understand why they coach, what's so attractive about it, to understand that and to protect that, whilst then trying to get at, okay, in order that we protect it, we've got to make the whole thing more, meaningful. And what we mean by that is to think about the intentionality. What are you trying to do when you have your group of athletes starting at 8:30 this evening? What are you trying to do you with them in relation to a game on Saturday, or maybe an event in a month's time? So get at the meaningfulness of that, and to raise them above this tyranny of the everyday.
Sounds great. Well, I'm looking forward to that session, actually.
Oh, yeah, you're on it.
You've given the game away a little bit there. I can start prepping. Thank you for that. So our final segment then, just before we wrap this all up, myth-busting, putting the world to rights. Anything from either of you that you'd like to dispel just before we finish up the podcast?
I always find this question a little bit difficult, to be honest. I suppose I'd go back to one of the things I mentioned in the podcast today. I am not a big fan of these simplistic antidote type recommendations for well-being, mental health, meaningfulness, whatever word you'd like to choose to describe it. I am just not a big fan of that. And I think it speaks to the organisation, it speaks to people in senior positions of organisations, how they conceptualise roles, how they conceptualise roles of others, and how they can have influence on them and how others are having influence on them. So I think that would be where I'd kind of point to a little bit of one of my myths. I'm not a big fan of this kind of cause effect antidote type recommendations for the complexities of every day, because it is tough. And I've finished where we started. Coaching is really hard, and there's some really good bits to it, really enjoyable bits to it, but there's also a lot of really bad bits, and we probably lose more than we win. And so we have to get on with that. And it's not to lose that either. That's so crucial. I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose the sadness either and then become sanitized. I want it to be emotive. And so any kind of antidote that takes that away is not helpful in my regard. I want to embrace all of it, but embrace it in a way that, as we've discussed, is both sustainable, meaningful, and with others.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Charlie that some of the coping interventions, dare I say it, I believe they bring a false consciousness, false comfort, false consciousness. The strong word to actually use is a deceit, but I genuinely don't think that they help in the long run, especially not for the sample of coaches that we certainly actually interviewed, and got some of the experience that you've alluded to. Here, Mike. So I think we need to actually realize where the limits of such interventions actually are, and start to engage with what we have in this article at a deeper, dare I say, more sustainable level for coaches.
Great. That brings us to the end. Huge thank you to both of you. Back-to-back podcast recordings this afternoon, so you've earned both yourselves a beer, I'm sure. Thanks again to Charlie and Robyn for their time today. You can check out that paper, Sustaining the Unsustainable, Meaningful Longevity and the Doing of Coaching. We'll put the links into the description as always. Big thanks again to the Sport Broadcast team letting us use their fabulous podcasting studio, and we're looking forward to being back in, and we're looking forward to being back with our listeners soon. We will be back with another episode shortly.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub podcast.
If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a rating and a review on your podcast platform. If you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe.
If you want to stay up to date with all of the latest work coming out of the Coaching Hub, please follow us on social media.
All the links to our social medias are in the podcast description below.